Welcome to the Business Results Program. This is how to transform yourself, your team, and your company to perform better and achieve higher results. Let's get started. I'm so happy you're here. My name is Pete Winarski, and I'm the CEO of Win Enterprises, LLC. Check out CompleteBusinessTransformation.com and look at the latest posts and resources we put there to serve you. I started this program because I want you to know that it doesn't have to be that hard. Business leaders like you struggle to get results, to build your team, to satisfy customers, to grow your businesses, and to stay sane in the middle of these crazy dynamics going on around you. My team and I have had full careers in business leadership roles, and we get it. We've had the same challenges as you, and we can share what we've learned, and we can make your life easier. In this program, I will be joined by various members of our team and other guests that I know can help you. We will offer new perspectives and share some of the secrets that you're just not hearing about anywhere else. The Business Results Program is your personal journey to improve yourself as you improve your company and achieve your most important goals and deliver the business results that make you and your team happy. Now, let's get to today's episode. Hey, Pete Winarski here with Business Results Radio, and let me tell you about today's episode here with my business partner in Win Enterprises, David Tweet. And David and I are going to talk about selling your business. So if you're a small business owner, you're probably wondering, what do you have to do? How to sell my business? What is this due diligence process? What do I do to maximize the sell price, the valuation, the amount of money that goes in my pocket in the end? And that's exactly what David and I are talking about. So enjoy this episode. This is a special process today because, as you'll notice here, David is driving on his vacation. And I said, no, dude, you can't go on vacation yet. We have this podcast episode to do. So that's what we're doing. We're making it happen for you. There's a lot of questions, a lot of demand, and frankly, a lot of confusion about this whole idea of, hey, I'm a small business owner. I want to sell my business someday. What do I do? What's the process? How do I make sure that I'm putting some money in my pocket? Those are the critical, basic questions that we get on a regular basis, and we answer them here for you today. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Business Results Radio. And this is a special and fun episode because David Tweet, our very own David Tweet, business partner and Win Enterprises, connoisseur of all things business improvement, is not only with me, but we're catching him driving down to go on vacation. And so if you're looking at a video clip of this very interview, you'll see David sitting in the back of his car while his wonderful wife and beautiful daughter are doing the driving part without the radio. So how torturous is that? Dave, how could you do that to them?
Hey, they are willing to sacrifice. They're very supportive.
That's fantastic. So what we're talking about today is all about you as a business owner, especially the smaller business owners who have your own company. And you're thinking that at some point you want to sell. And the question is, well, how do I sell my business? How do I sell my company in the first place? So we're going to talk about that. There's some elements of the process that we're going to uncover for you. And, then we'll get into some of the specifics. So I'm going to interview Dave. Now, the truth is we both know the answers to these questions, but we're going to format it in a way that makes it easy for you, the listener, to kind of catch on to what's going on. And we'll just have a dialogue about it and see if we can get you to appreciate the methodology, the process a little bit. Because if I were you owning a business, I'd be thinking about the end game. Where is it at what point in time that I am going to get out of my business? And how do I do it in such a way that actually put money in my pocket and put a lot of money in my pocket, maximizing what I put in there, and which is really important because how many businesses, Dave, have you heard of where a business owner didn't understand the process and then maybe they didn't even bother to sell, right? It just disappears off the face of the earth and they got nothing for it.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Just the other day, Pete, I heard a statistic that 80 to 90% of the small businesses that want to sell don't end up successfully selling their business for a multitude of reasons. And what's interesting is, some of those reasons include the owner overvaluating their business, or there's a whole bunch of risk that the business has that scare the potential buyer away. And those are just a couple of the highest or more popular ones. And the list goes on and on. So, that's question number one is, do I want to sell? Then question number two, what is the process so that I can be, one, successful, and two, really go after and try to achieve that target walk away dollar in my pocket that some business owners don't even think about what that could look and feel like.
Yeah, and by the way, what we're talking about here when we're saying, hey, you as a business owner walking away with a maximum amount in your pocket, we're not talking about taking advantage of the buyer. We're talking about building an entity in your business that has the value that is worth every single penny of what you sell it for, right? So if you understand not just the process, but what will drive your valuation up, and then when the buyer comes in, they're getting something that's a good deal for them at a bigger number versus if you didn't know these things and then you end up not valuing your company at a big number, not putting a lot of money in your pocket when you do choose to sell. So, it's interesting, Dave. One of the reasons you just described, is on the mark where, a business owner doesn't really know how to value their company and they value it way higher than it's actually worth. And as a result, it doesn't sell. We have a friend of ours, one of the people in our advisor network, because frankly, even us, we are business advisors and business consultants. We've been at this for decades, and yet we still have our mentors and our advisors. And one of them pointed out, said, yeah, in our experience, every business owner is delusional when it comes to thinking about the value of their own company until they go through a process like what we'll describe here on this podcast. So let's get into this a little bit. Dave, the process, how do I sell my business? If I were a business owner and I just like, okay, I think I'm going to want to sell this thing in a year or two, what's the process? What do I need to know?
So, step one is a year or two may not be enough time. So think about the timeline and the amount of activity that's required. So ideally, you want to be thinking about selling your business in 3 to 5 years.
Mm.
And I'll tell you, because that last year that's all prepping the business for sale. So any type of change that's required to really remove any of the risk that a potential buyer may see, that needs to happen a good within years 1 through 4, so that year 4 and 5, you're ready, you're putting it, getting the message out, and your business is now bringing in the suitors that you really want to talk to. So step number 1 is consider the timeline. And then 2 is there's a lot of preliminary questions that you as the owner need to answer. So the first one is, when you are going to sell, what group of buyers are you considering selling to? So would it be strategic? a competitor that would potentially buy you? Would it be private equity? That's a totally different answer if you're looking to have a private equity company come in and buy you. Are you looking to sell it to family? Are you looking to sell it to the employees? So the list goes on and on. And then the next question that you need to answer is, during this process, do you want to take some money off the table early on and then go for a sale event on the year 5 mark or so? Or do you want to not take money off the table and continue driving to really optimize the value and then go for the sale event, at the end? So initial questions to start thinking about.
Let me help the listener here a little bit with a couple of the points you brought up. So, and we'll go kind of backwards. Taking money off the table. What do you mean by that?
So when I say taking money off the table, one of the questions that owners have is, hey, I'd like to have some extra spending money in my pocket now for equity in my company that I can go on some vacations so I don't have to wait 5 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of different mechanisms to do that don't take away from the valuation of your company.
Very good. Yeah. And that's important because you as the business owner, you might not realize that is even a possible strategy that you can put into place. And therefore you're like, well, I don't want to sell my company yet because I want to do these other things first. And the reality is you can do both. You can have your cake and eat it as well. So let's, one of the process steps, Dave, that you and I have in our language is a quote unquote due diligence. And I want to talk about that in a second, especially in the context of recognizing that there are different potential types of buyers. And so maybe let's define the different buyers first. So you talked about a private equity buyer. What are they really interested in?
So the private equity buyer, they're primarily interested in the potential of the company. So what do you have either in terms of long-term contracts, in terms of intellectual property, patents, customer base that very few others have access to, those aspects that they can leverage to really drive up the growth of your company after they purchase.
Yeah. And of course, the private equity owner may choose to only buy and then own the company for a short period of time, meaning a few years, maybe 3 or 5 years. And then they sell it, hopefully for them, at an even greater valuation because of what they were able to do with it. So that's the private equity side. Now, a strategic
there's one more there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is they're looking for very cash rich companies. And what I mean by that is companies that have very high EBITDA percentages, because that cash flow is the fuel that allows them to use to really accelerate that growth.
Yep. And EBITDA, for the listeners, being a measure of profit, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It's pretty darn close to the bottom line. So we talk about profit, we talk about bottom line. EBITDA is one of those key measures. And so that's the private equity world. Now, what about a strategic buyer? What do you mean by strategic buyer?
So a strategic buyer, think of, any company out there, there's multiple competitors that either they have a particular design that makes them really thrive within the market they serve. So let me give you an example. If we're building widgets and my company has the absolute best widget on the market, okay? And let's even say I went as far as getting elements of that patented. That's blocking a competitor from getting into the market and copying my widget
Mm-hmm.
to compete with me head to head. So you may, if you're a competitor, you may choose to buy me. So you would then have access to that patented widget so that you can now take that unique and special product to all of your customers as well as to my existing customers.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows both companies to grow very quickly.
You hear stories of companies buying someone else, another business, because what they have, they want, and they want to make sure that no one else gets it, right? Because
Correct.
if one of your competitors actually bought this other technology, capability, whatever it is, then that could hurt your business. And so being strategic in that way. And I also want to talk about the strategic buyer that's in an adjacent market, not necessarily a direct competitor. And
Mhm.
that's a case of you make the widget, or you're the company, you as the small business owner who's selling, and it could be that the strategic buyer who wants to buy you doesn't currently make a widget, but they make something that is adjacent to that, meaning it's similar to or supportive or in the same larger market space. So, for example, we have a client of ours over years that is creates and makes material handling equipment for inside of a distribution center. Everything that moves from an order to shipping it out. So the warehousing, the structuring, the conveyors, all of that, all automated in this major way. And the company that bought them doesn't do that. They did fork trucks, a fork truck company buying other material handling stuff, right? Those are adjacencies. And that's why it made sense from a strategic buyer standpoint. So that's the strategic buyer side. And then, of course, you talked about friends and family, or other, not private equity, not a strategic buyer. It could be just an entrepreneur who says, I want to get in the game. I want to play business. I want to be a business leader. I've had this other great long career. I've got some money saved up. I have some people who are willing to back me because they know I'm a pretty good skilled manager, and I want to go buy a company. So of those other options, what are some of the things that they might look for?
So let's talk first particular owners that have built up a business and they have surrounded themselves with really energetic, go-getting, powerhouses of a team around them that have helped build the company up with them, with that owner. That owner may decide and say, I want to sell my business to my employees. Okay. So in that particular case, those employees, those buyers, they know every single skeleton that's in the closet already.
They sure
There
do.
is no, making it look pretty. However, those employees want to know that there is longevity after the owner exits.
Mm-hmm.
So, in one example, one business owner we're talking to, he does 80% of the sales for the company. So what do you think is going to happen if nothing changed and that owner walked away?
There goes 80%.
80%, 80% of that volume goes away. So if that owner really wants to sell the business to the employees, he would need to put in place a mechanism for someone or a group of people to take over and own the sales aspect so that there isn't a risk of him exiting and then impacting the company.
Mm-hmm.
The employees would want to see that in place. The employees would also want to see, all right, so if there is a void in leadership after the owner leaves, what are we going to do? So what are you doing to develop those employees into the future executives of the company. And the list goes on and on. But those are some things to think about if you want to sell to employees. Now, if you want to sell to family members, like I have a child that I want to take over the business. And Pete, one good friend of both of ours, he is not a family member, but he's working in a family-owned business where the owner is trying to groom the next generation. Now, the two individuals that are part of that next generation, one is really showing high potential. She's not fully ready, but she's showing high potential. The other one, not so much.
Not so much.
So the owner has a decision to make. How do I really make those two individuals fully prepared? Now that gets into, is there particular executive mentoring that, the owner could bring in? And Pete, we do executive mentoring. So is that something that the owner would say, Pete, I want you to come in. I want you to set up an executive mentoring program for these two individuals. I want to give them every opportunity. And it's their choice if they step up and step into that responsibility or if not. But at least the owner's giving them the opportunity to grow without just throwing them in the deep end and hoping they swim. So that's selling to family members. And then the third is, just selling to an entrepreneur that wants to get into and buy a business. So in that case, that entrepreneur is, again, similar to employees. He's going to want to know about longevity and stability of the company. He's also going to want to know what contingency planning is already in place that will help provide the stability in case of shifts in the market, shifts in the supply chain, or worst case, some pandemic that just happens to pop up out of the blue. How is that company going to survive through those different challenges?
Yeah, being confident that there is a future of the business for when they take it over, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So with all of those various potential buyers in mind, and you may be surprised, you may think that, hey, we're setting this ourselves up for one type of buyer and maybe another type of buyer emerges. So that's all certainly possible for you. The process, let's get back to the process now. There's this exercise where a potential buyer says, I'm interested, and then they do a due diligence exercise. Just describe what that basically means. What is a due diligence?
So a due diligence is going through the entire company and looking at all aspects of how business is done, how decisions are made, how strategies are developed and executed, and how the product or service flows to the end client. So at a super high level. Now, what they're looking for is they're looking for elements of risk that I would need to navigate or address if I were to buy this company. So here's one example, Pete, a recent due diligence that you were working with one of our teams, and they were looking at a couple different sites. And I believe, and you can share more detail, the safety measures in those two sites were not up to expectation. So that's a risk.
Right.
And that's a huge investment that the future owner would need to make before they do anything else. They need to elevate the safety so that their employees don't get hurt.
Yeah. So when you come at it from a understanding the risk perspective, you can look at a company's financials and say, oh, they look like they're a pretty good deal, right? This looks like we can figure out what the price probably ought to be based on what's on paper. But then you have to take a look at the physical three-dimensional company and how it operates. And this is where you walk through the building and you say, are there holes in the ceiling? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the idea, just as you would when you are looking to buy a house, you have the listing and it looks great on the listing. You pull up the address, like, oh, it's a great neighborhood. It's a great school district. You pull up the comps. The comps suggest that I can buy this house for, let's say, $350,000. All right. So do you buy it? No, you probably take a look first, right? You go visit. You say, let's arrange to go walk inside. I want to walk around. I want to look at the roof. I want to look at the grounds. Is the driveway falling apart or is it in good shape? And then I walk in. I'm like, oh, I like the way the inside looks. I like the hardwood floors and the fixtures and all this other stuff, and everything seems sound. And then you have an inspector come in and they test out some of the things that you, the homeowner, might not have the expertise to see.
Right. And in the case of a business, in addition to the structural, if you're walking through this business, you're also looking at the face of the employees. Are they engaged or are they totally disengaged, disenfranchised with what's going on in the business? What's the leadership style? Here's one example: is the site that I went to last week, where this was a site that was just acquired 2 years ago. The prior owners were so much of command and control, where they were like generals in an army, and they were directing everyone. Well, that culture, they are still, after 2 years, struggling to shift that culture because it was so ingrained in the workforce. And also, those owners, the prior owners, also didn't share any data. So when you're asking, well, how do you make these decisions? Oh yeah, we never did. The boss just told us what to do. Mm-hmm. Okay, what data did he look at? Oh, he didn't share that. So that's some of the intangible aspects that you're going to want to look at. If that's happening in your business, then what are you going to do differently so that a buyer doesn't get scared away?
Really well said.
If it's right, or if it's not happening in your business and you're a potential buyer, how do you pick up on that very quickly to know, oh yeah, this is going to take years after I buy in order to address it, which will affect my profit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to summarize what a due diligence is, it's basically I start with my understanding of the business from what data I have on paper, including their financial statements, including anything else I can get my hands on that the company shares. And I calculate based on that what I think the value would be. And then I go and I take a look. And I may have gotten some insights and some hypotheses from looking at the numbers that say, you better check, let's say that in the workers' comp claim expense seems a little bit high. Well, that might suggest I better take a look at the safety processes, make sure we don't have a problem there, right? And then when you're physically there, you have the opportunity as you're walking through to check on that. Or if there's let's say there's a high equipment cost which indicates some capital improvements lately. Like, okay, I want to see what these capital improvements were. Did they buy new state-of-the-art equipment, in which case I ought to see that and I ought to be impressed by how they're operating. And so if I get there and they're there, but they're really not operating very well, then that says something about the way that they've implemented the solutions that they've paid money for. All
Right.
of that is data and input. You still have to process it and make decisions, but you have the opportunity to do that from seeing things with your own eyes.
So one other is, an example, if I have a quality issue, what's the root cause of that quality? Do I have internal processes, again, like you said, with safety and with quality, or do I have a supplier issue that is providing me the poor quality raw material? And if that's the case, what are you going to do if you buy this company? It may be a great company, but if you have a really bad supply chain, what actions are you going to take, and how do you address those quickly so that you can raise that quality to what you're delivering out? It spirals into a lot of different avenues that a due diligence would pick up on all of these aspects.
Right. And here's the bottom line is you see what you see, and then you have to ask yourself, well, do I believe that if you've uncovered a problem, for example, that I can fix that problem, or is it
Mhm.
one that's not fixable? And then based on that, what does that do to my amount of money that I would put towards the valuation? Does that bring the number up or down? Like buying a house. If you notice the roof is old and the roof has issues and the roof needs to be replaced, that $350,000 comp, maybe instead of offering 350 because that's a fair price, otherwise you elect to offer 320 because you know you're going to have to put $30,000 into a roof or into a roof and other fixes,
Right.
right? That's the sort of thinking that you wouldn't have available if you didn't walk the process and see in a due diligence. So, Dave,
Right.
evaluation. Let's talk about, we've been using that phrase, it's what is the company valued at? Ultimately, a transaction is an agreed price between a buyer and a seller. So
Mhm.
there's a valuation exercise that the seller is doing. They think, oh, it's worth this. And there's a valuation exercise that the buyer is doing. They say, no, we think it's worth this. And then they try and converge. So what goes into a valuation?
So all the different aspects that we just talked about go into that valuation that either reduce, because in your example, Pete, the roof is really old, it's going to need to be replaced, or it adds to the valuation, such as there's patent or intellectual property that is extremely valuable, or there's this company that you have is disrupting the industry. And there's a lot of great articles and examples out there of industry disruptors. What is going on that, if this disruption is totally changing the landscape, that's going to add to the valuation of your company. So it's how it's positioned. So then, you get into the valuation aspect, and then you have to understand is, would a buyer agree with the way you're thinking about it? Because a seller may say, oh, it's beautiful, I got this house, it's gorgeous, it's ready to move in. And a buyer may come in and say, yeah, it's a beautiful house, but you have termites, you have all these other issues going on. So you have to look at it during the valuation. What's very critical is you have to look at it from a non-biased perspective. And
For you,
that's why it's really valuable to have someone that doesn't have emotional attachment to your company.
well, what you said is really, really key. Just as if you were the person who built the house and then designed the interior and then put everything together, you've got your heart and soul into that thing versus if you moved in a year ago and are moving out because you got a job transfer and your company is paying for your moving costs and all of that, your heart and soul is going to be at a different level, right? And so the same is true for you as the company owner. If you built this company from scratch, from ground up, your heart and soul is in there. So there is a bias and you need to recognize that. Let me just say a few words about valuation. There is not one way to value a company. There's lots of ways to value a company. Back when I was at McKinsey and Company, I was handed this book about how to value a company. It was like 3 inches thick, right? This big, giant 3 inches thick book about valuation. It's basically a function of your financials. So you have your revenue, and then all minus all the costs equals a profit. So David mentioned before EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So that's key. So let me say a few words about valuation. Back when I was at McKinsey and Company, I started there and they handed me this big fat 3 inches thick book about how to value a company. So valuation, there's not one way, there's lots of ways. And it's a really basically a function of your company's financials, so revenue or profit, and then what we call a multiple. And the multiple is if it's a multiple on revenue or if it's a multiple on profit, it's okay. So if let's say you're a $10 million revenue company, is your multiple 1 times revenue, 2 times revenue, 0.5 times revenue? That's a formula that you would have to figure out. Or if it's based on your EBITDA or your profit, is it 3 times EBITDA, 8 times EBITDA, 12 or 15 times EBITDA? That's a multiple factor that's based on all of these other variables that we've been talking about. So there's not one way to value, there's lots of ways to value. And it has to do with understanding your industry, your business, the features that you have that are either raise your multiple and therefore raise your valuation or subtract from. So if there's a lot of risk in your business, your valuation will come down because your multiple will reduce. If you have a lot of advantages that no one else has, your multiple goes up. That factor goes up, which means your valuation goes up. So that's valuation in a nutshell. So Dave, I just talked about multiples. What are some things that drive multiples up?
So we've been talking about a lot of those things that drive multiples up. We were talking about access to customers, unique groups of customers, access to unique industries that may be adjacent. It could be particular designs or something that is intellectual property. It could be location. In one case, and this is going back to our wire mold days, Pete, wire mold was acquired by Legrand. Now, what were some of the big reasons that drove the multiple up for wire mold when Legrand came in? It was the whole distribution network that wire mold had in place. It had customer base and the way the product was delivered to those customers. That was one aspect that Legrand loved and they wanted access to. They didn't want to go build it themselves. So it goes back to the old adage, I can build it or I can buy it. So those are some examples that would drive your multiple up.
And then let's talk about some of the risks that might be in place that would drive a multiple down and therefore put less money in your pocket when you eventually sell. What are the risks?
So you have concentration within the leadership. So if you have one leader that is making a wide variety of decisions or impact in the business, and that leader just happens to be an owner, that would drive multiple down. You have customer concentration. So if you have one customer that is equal to greater than 15% of your business, that would drive multiples down. You have supplier concentration. So if you have one supplier that supplies 40% of your raw material, well, what happens if that one supplier?
Well, on the supplier side, supplier concentration, basically it's anywhere where there's risk. So if one supplier is doing a lot of your volume, if lightning strikes the supplier and puts them out of operation, that means you're out of operation. So that's where the risk comes into play. So we hit leadership concentration, customer concentration, supplier concentration. What else, Dave?
You have, even within your operation, if you're, if you're a manufacturing company and you have critical machines in your plant and you don't have redundancy or ways to manufacture or plans that you've mapped out, if this critical machine goes down, what are the plans so that you don't impact your customer base? So that's within, your overall process would be another example.
And this is just scratching the surface, folks. I mean, if we've illustrated some examples with manufacturing companies, but what if you're a retail business? You have some risks there too. Same basic types of things. You have leadership, you have customers, you have suppliers, right? So all of those same things. You have employees. If you have excellent processes and procedures and your employees are really interchangeable because of how great those methods and processes are, and you can hire a person in and train them up really quick, that's a plus. If you have nothing in place, you have a couple key employees who seem to know everything and they teach one-on-one just from what's in their head to a new employee, that's bad, right? That's a minus, because if lightning strikes that person and they're gone and they don't work for you any longer, you just lost a whole lot of knowledge base. That's a risk. So there's a whole lot of these pluses and minuses. And so basically, you look at all of the pluses, you add them up, you look at all the minuses, you subtract them down. And from whatever the base multiple is, given your industry, given your type of company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there's a whole lot of factors, your valuation changes. So what we want for you, we want you to know how to go and load up and increase the multiple. We want you to look at how do we go and create a situation where we end up with a better level of performance over time, which means our financials improve, and all of those other dynamics, this big long to-do list basically of what will drive the multiple up. How do we end up creating change over the course of, and this is why David was saying, if you want to sell a year or two from now, you probably don't have a lot of time to make impact on your valuation and on maximizing what would go in your pocket. If you have 3 years, 5 years, you have time to impact your to-do list. That's the bottom line for this game of how do I sell my business? Fundamentally, you might get an answer from your accountant that says, oh, well, you go get a business broker, they'll list it for you. Someone will come in and make you an offer. You do a transaction, it's sold. Congratulations. While that's true, you're missing the main point, which is how do you maximize for yourself, the business owner, while leaving the legacy that you want to have for your employees, for your company? There's longevity there. Basically, what do you want? Do you want it, sell it and not ever think about it again? Or do you want to sell it and feel proud that you left something behind? Really, that's a personal choice. And that's part of maximizing. So, we talk about this in our endgame maximization program. Some of you have been on winenterprisesllc.com and see in the solutions tab, you see the endgame maximization. Some of you are on this podcast listening to this because you went to the website first and it came around and you heard about this podcast. Either way, whatever the direction is, what we described today on this podcast is basically the structure of how to think about your end game and how to maximize your end game. Clearly, there's a lot of details, Dave, right? David, we left out a ton of detail. We can go on for hours about this, but the structure is there. What did we miss? Did we not talk about something that's critical that we need to share before we wrap up?
You nailed it, Pete. We just scratched the surface. I mean, the categories that we go helping you develop that strategy over the next 3 to 5 years to really maximize that walk away number. There's so much more, and we can get into at another podcast. If there's particular funding that is required to really accelerate that change, to then deliver that outcome back, that's another huge opportunity.
So Dave, as you just pointed out, we were just scratching the surface, and there's a lot to this. There's things like, should I go and get some financing to help fund some changes, which is something that I do now that accelerates the change and puts some things in place so that there's a plus minus that helps out in my favor, right? And of course, you got to analyze that and take a look at that. There's things that you might prioritize and say, I only have so much time, I only have so much money, so I'm going to be able to do these changes. I'm not going to worry about these other ones. And you figure out, well, which are the most important, right? All of that is part of the formula here that you want to follow when you maximize your end game. So let me wrap it up this way. David, thank you for joining us while you're starting your vacation. Thank you, sir, for being in the car and really fighting through traffic and all of that from the back seat with your two wonderful drivers up in the front. So we appreciate you being here. And
Absolutely.
for all you listeners, thanks for hanging out with us. And we look forward to talking to you again more. Catch another episode of Business Results Radio. Come see us on our website, winenterprisesllc.com, and we're here for you. All right, take care, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of Business Results Radio. Remember to share this episode on social media or directly with people you think would benefit from it.